candles had burned low in the grand ballroom of Greystone Manor when Charlotte Winters heard the sound that would change everything. A heavy, sickening thud that echoed through the marble corridors like thunder in a crypt. She had been standing in the shadows of the servants' entrance, invisible as always, waiting for Lady Pemberton to finish her gossiping so she could escort the elderly woman home. But that sound froze the blood in her veins and sent her heart racing with a primal fear she couldn't name. Within moments, the screaming began. The Duchess of Greystone's wail pierced the night like a wounded animal, and suddenly the entire household was rushing toward the grand staircase. Charlotte followed instinctively, her modest grey dress allowing her to slip through the chaos unnoticed, as she had learned to do so well in the 3 years since her husband's death had left her penniless and dependent on the charity of others. What she saw at the bottom of those magnificent stairs would haunt her for weeks to come. The powerful Duke of Greystone, one of England's most influential peers, lying twisted and broken on the cold marble floor, his neck bent at an impossible angle, his eyes still open and staring at nothing. The horror of it struck her like a physical blow, but even in that moment of collective shock, Charlotte's observant nature couldn't help but notice the details that others missed in their panic and grief. She noticed the way the Duke's jacket was torn at the shoulder, as if someone had grabbed him. She noticed the defensive wounds on his hands, the scratches that suggested he had fought against something or someone in his final moments. She noticed the small puddle of spilled brandy on the landing above, and the way the carpet runner had bunched up at the top of the stairs, as if disturbed by a struggle. But most of all, she noticed Lord Edmund Fairfax standing at the edge of the crowd, the Duke's impoverished cousin who had been living off the family's grudging charity for years, and the expression on his pale face was not one of shock or grief. It was satisfaction, carefully masked but unmistakable to someone who had learned to read the subtle language of faces and gestures in her years of social invisibility. While everyone else wept and wailed and called for doctors who could do nothing for a man so obviously dead, Lord Fairfax stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, his lips pressed into a thin line that might have been mistaken for sorrow, but looked far too much like suppressed triumph. Charlotte felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold night air streaming through the open doors. "I'm so glad you're here with me today, diving into a story of mystery, courage, and unexpected love, set in the glittering yet dangerous world of Regency London. If you enjoy tales where an underestimated woman rises to challenge the powerful and find justice where no one else dares to look, please subscribe and leave a like. It helps me bring you more stories like this one. Now let me take you back to that terrible night, and to the woman who refused to stay silent. The weeks that followed the Duke's death were a blur of black mourning clothes and hushed conversations in drawing rooms across London. The official verdict came swiftly. A tragic accident, they said, caused by the Duke's well-known habit of taking a nightcap before bed and his unfortunate misstep on the stairs. The physicians examined the body and found nothing suspicious beyond the injuries consistent with such a fall. The magistrate closed the investigation within days, eager to spare the grieving Duchess any further pain and unwilling to sully the reputation of such a distinguished family with unseemly questions. Society mourned appropriately, with all the proper rituals and ceremonies befitting a man of the Duke's stature, and then promptly moved on to the next scandal, the next ball, the next concern of their privileged lives. But Charlotte could not move on. She lay awake night after night in her small borrowed room in Lady Pemberton's townhouse, seeing those defensive wounds on the Duke's hands, seeing Lord Fairfax's carefully controlled expression, seeing the bunched carpet and the torn jacket. She knew what she had seen, and she knew what it meant, even if no one else cared to look closely enough to see it too. She tried at first to voice her concerns through the proper channels. She mentioned her observations to Lady Pemberton, who patted her hand kindly and suggested that the shock of witnessing such a terrible accident had affected her nerves. She attempted to speak with the magistrate's clerk, who barely looked up from his ledgers, before dismissing her as a hysterical woman with too much time and too little sense. She even wrote a carefully worded letter to the investigating physician, outlining the inconsistencies she had observed, only to receive a cold response, informing her that her amateur observations were neither requested nor appreciated. With each dismissal, each patronizing smile, each implication that her woman's mind was simply too delicate to understand such matters, Charlotte felt a familiar burning frustration rise in her chest. It was the same frustration she had felt when her late husband's creditors had refused to believe she understood the accounts, when her own family had insisted she needed a man to manage her affairs, when society had decided that a penniless widow had nothing of value to contribute beyond her ability to fetch shawls, and nod sympathetically during tedious conversations. She was invisible, voiceless, powerless, and a murderer was about to inherit a dukedom because no one would listen to her. But Charlotte Winters had not survived 3 years of genteel poverty and social humiliation by giving up easily. If the proper channels would not listen, then she would find someone who had no choice but to pay attention. She would go to the one man in London with the power, the connections and the intellect to actually investigate the truth. Sebastian Ravenswood, the Marquess of Thornfield, the Duke's closest political ally, and a man whose reputation for ruthless intelligence preceded him like a winter storm. It was a desperate plan, perhaps even a foolish one, but Charlotte had learned long ago that desperate times called for bold action. And so on a grey morning in late October, she put on her most respectable dress, pinned up her dark hair with trembling fingers, and set out for Thornfield House to confront one of the most formidable men in England with an accusation of murder that no one else believed. She had no idea that this decision would not only uncover a killer, but would also transform her own life in ways she could never have imagined. Thornfield House stood in Mayfair like a fortress of dark stone and iron gates, its austere facade reflecting perfectly the character of the man who resided within. Charlotte had passed by it countless times during her years as Lady Pemberton's companion, always with a small shiver of intimidation at its imposing presence. The Marquess of Thornfield was a legend in London society, a man who had inherited his title at 23 after his father's sudden death and had transformed the family's fortunes through shrewd political maneuvering and an almost frightening degree of intelligence. He served on the King's Council, advised half the peers in Parliament, and was known for his ability to see through any deception or manipulation with a single glance from those cold grey eyes. He was also known for his complete emotional detachment, a quality that had only intensified after the death of his young wife, 5 years earlier in a riding accident that some whispered had never been properly investigated. Sebastian Ravenswood did not suffer fools, did not engage in social pleasantries, and certainly did not grant audiences to penniless widows with wild theories about murdered dukes. Yet here, Charlotte stood at his door, her hand trembling slightly as she rang the bell, knowing that she was about to either make the most important move of her life or utterly destroy what little reputation she had left. The butler who answered looked her up and down with the particular brand of disdain that servants of great houses reserved for those of ambiguous social standing, and she could see him preparing to send her away before she even opened her mouth. But Charlotte had prepared for this moment with the same meticulous attention to detail that had allowed her to notice what everyone else had missed at Greystone Manor. She presented her card with the name of Lady Pemberton clearly visible, mentioned that she came on a matter of utmost urgency regarding the late Duke of Greystone, and watched as the butler's expression shifted from contempt to uncertainty. The Duke's name still carried weight even in death, and the possibility that this shabby widow might actually have legitimate business related to such an important man was enough to earn her a cold marble bench in the entrance hall and a long, anxious wait. She sat there for nearly an hour, watching the grandfather clock tick away the minutes and trying to organize her thoughts into something coherent and convincing. She knew she would have perhaps 5 minutes of the Marquess's attention before he dismissed her as the others had, and she needed to use those minutes wisely. She rehearsed her opening words, discarded them, tried again. She pulled out the small notebook where she had recorded every detail she could remember from that night, every observation that had struck her as wrong. The torn jacket, the defensive wounds, the brandy stain, the bunched carpet, Lord Fairfax's expression, the convenient timing of his presence at the manor, the massive inheritance he stood to gain. Each detail alone might be explained away, but together they painted a picture that Charlotte could not unsee, no matter how much London's finest investigators, insisted there was nothing to investigate. When the butler finally returned and led her through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced Ravenswood ancestors, Charlotte's heart was beating so hard she feared it might be audible in the oppressive silence. They stopped before a heavy oak door, and the butler knocked once before opening it to reveal a study that took Charlotte's breath away. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, thousands of them, and the massive desk near the window was covered with papers and maps and correspondence that spoke of a mind constantly engaged with the complex machinery of politics and power. And behind that desk sat Sebastian Ravenswood himself, and Charlotte understood immediately why people found him so intimidating. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 35, with dark hair touched with premature silver at the temples, and a face that might have been handsome if it hadn't been set in such harsh, unforgiving lines. But it was his eyes that truly unsettled her. Pale grey and penetrating, they fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel as if he could read every thought in her head before she spoke a single word. He did not stand when she entered, did not offer her a seat, did not waste time with pleasantries. He simply looked at her with those terrible, knowing eyes and waited for her to explain why she had dared to disturb him with her presence. Charlotte felt every instinct screaming at her to apologize and flee, to retreat back into the safe invisibility that had protected her for so long. But then she thought of the Duke lying broken at the bottom of those stairs, and of Lord Fairfax's satisfied smile, and of all the times in her life when powerful men had dismissed her observations simply because she was a woman without status or fortune. She straightened her spine, met those intimidating grey eyes directly, and began to speak about murder in a voice that only trembled slightly at the edges. Sebastian Ravenswood listened to her account with an expression of such complete neutrality that Charlotte couldn't tell if he thought her mad, foolish, or merely wasting his valuable time. She spoke quickly but precisely, laying out each observation in logical order, referencing the notes in her small leather notebook when necessary to ensure she missed no detail. She described the torn jacket, the defensive wounds that the official report had dismissed as injuries sustained during the fall, the position of the Duke's body that suggested he had been facing his attacker rather than simply tumbling forward. She mentioned the brandy stain on the landing and the bunched carpet that no servant would have left in such disarray in a house as meticulously maintained as Greystone Manor. And finally, with her heart in her throat, she spoke of Lord Fairfax, his presence at the manor that evening when he supposedly had been in the city, his financial desperation that was well known among the servants, his immediate inheritance of not only the title, but the vast Greystone fortune that included 3 estates and an income of £30,000 per year. When she finished, silence filled the study like a physical presence, broken only by the ticking of an ornate clock on the mantelpiece. The Marquess leaned back in his chair, steeping his fingers beneath his chin in a gesture that struck Charlotte as both calculating and dismissive. He studied her for a long moment with those penetrating eyes, and she could practically see him categorizing her, assessing her motivations, determining whether she was a woman of sense or simply another hysterical female seeking attention through dramatic accusations. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and cold, carrying the particular kind of aristocratic disdain that could flay skin from bone without a single raised syllable. He informed her that he had read the official reports, that the physicians and magistrates were men of education and experience who had found absolutely no evidence of foul play, and that the tragic death of his friend and political ally was painful enough without delusional women inventing murder plots where none existed. He suggested, in a tone that made clear it was not really a suggestion at all, that she return to her employer and focus her energies on more appropriate pursuits for a woman of her station. The dismissal was absolute, and Charlotte felt the familiar burn of humiliation rising in her cheeks as she realized she had failed yet again. But something in his words, or perhaps in the way his jaw tightened when he mentioned reading the official reports, made Charlotte pause at the study door rather than fleeing as every instinct demanded. She turned back to face him, and later she would marvel at where she found the courage to challenge one of the most powerful men in England when he had just so thoroughly dismissed her. She asked him, in a voice that shook only slightly, If he had truly been satisfied with those reports, or if perhaps some small part of him had questioned the convenient timing and the cursory nature of the investigation. She reminded him that the Duke had been his closest ally, a man who had supported him politically and personally, and she wondered aloud whether a true friend would not want absolute certainty that his death had indeed been an accident. And then, before he could respond with what she was certain would be a crushing set-down, she mentioned something she had learned from the servants' gossip, that Sebastian Ravenswood's own wife had died 5 years earlier in a riding accident that had never quite made sense, a fall from a horse she had ridden expertly since childhood, on familiar ground, on a clear day with no apparent cause. The change in the Marquess's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The cold neutrality cracked for just a moment, revealing something raw and painful beneath the aristocratic armor. Charlotte saw his hands tighten on the arms of his chair, saw a muscle jump in his jaw, saw the way his eyes darkened with what might have been old grief or old rage, or perhaps both intertwined beyond separation. She had struck a nerve, had found the one wound that still bled beneath all that carefully maintained control, and she felt both triumph and terror at what she had done. Sebastian stood slowly from his chair, and for a moment Charlotte genuinely feared she had pushed too far, that he would have her thrown out or worse for daring to mention his dead wife. But instead he walked to the window, his back rigid with tension, and stared out at the grey London street for what felt like an eternity before he finally spoke again. His voice, when it came, was different than before, quieter, harder, edged with something that might have been pain or fury or bitter understanding. He told her without turning from the window that she would return the following morning at 8 o'clock, and that she would bring every scrap of evidence she possessed, every observation, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, every piece of servants' gossip she had overheard. He told her that if she was wasting his time with fantasies born of an overactive imagination, he would ensure that no respectable house in London would ever employ her again. But if, and he emphasized that single word with devastating precision, if there was even the smallest possibility that she was right, and that someone had murdered his friend and gotten away with it because the authorities were too lazy or too deferential to look closely enough, then he would use every resource at his considerable disposal to uncover the truth and see justice done. Charlotte left Thornfield House that afternoon with her hands trembling and her heart racing, uncertain whether she had just saved herself or doomed herself completely, but knowing without question that she had set something in motion that could not be stopped. Charlotte returned to Thornfield House the next morning, with her notebook clutched in trembling hands and a leather satchel containing every scrap of evidence she had managed to gather in the week since the Duke's death. She had barely slept, spending the night organizing her thoughts and fighting the twin demons of hope and fear that warred in her chest. The same disdainful butler admitted her, but this time he led her not to the formal study, but to a smaller, more intimate library on the second floor, where Sebastian Ravenswood waited with an expression that suggested he had also spent a sleepless night wrestling with demons of his own. He gestured curtly for her to sit, and for the next 3 hours they went through every detail of her observations with the meticulous precision of a military campaign. The Marquess asked questions that cut straight to the heart of each piece of evidence, challenging her assumptions, demanding that she justify every conclusion, pushing her to remember details she had thought forgotten. And Charlotte, who had spent years being dismissed and underestimated, found herself rising to meet his intellectual demands with a fierce determination that surprised them both. She had brought more than just her observations from the night of the death. In the week since, she had quietly investigated Lord Fairfax's movements and circumstances with the particular advantage of invisibility that her social position afforded her. Servants talked freely in front of companions and poor relations, treating them as little more than furniture, and Charlotte had learned to listen with careful attention to every carelessly dropped word. She had discovered that Lord Fairfax had been in desperate financial straits, that he owed gambling debts to some of London's most dangerous moneylenders, and that he had been seen arguing violently with the Duke just 2 days before the fatal accident. She had learned from a lady's maid who had a follower among the Greystone footmen that Lord Fairfax had been staying at the manor that week, despite his claims of being in the city, and that he had been seen on the upper floors near the grand staircase less than an hour before the Duke's fall. Each piece of information alone might be circumstantial, but together they formed a pattern that even Sebastian's skeptical mind could not entirely dismiss. As the morning wore into afternoon, something shifted in the atmosphere of that quiet library. The Marquis's initial hostile skepticism gradually transformed into something more complex, a reluctant respect for Charlotte's observational skills perhaps, or a recognition that her mind worked with the same logical precision as his own, despite her lack of formal education. He began to share his own observations about the official investigation, pointing out inconsistencies in the physician's report that he had noticed but dismissed at the time, mentioning questions that had occurred to him but that he had not pursued out of deference to the grieving family. And then, in a moment of unexpected vulnerability that Charlotte would remember for the rest of her life, Sebastian told her about his wife. He spoke in a flat, emotionless voice that somehow made the pain more evident rather than less, describing how Catherine had died on a sunny morning while riding in their own park, how her neck had been broken in a fall that made no sense given her expertise and the gentle nature of her mare. He told Charlotte about the hasty inquest that had ruled it an accident, about the magistrate who had refused to investigate further, about the whispers he had heard suggesting that Catherine's riding companion that morning had been Lord Ashworth, a man who had been courting her before her marriage, and who had inherited a significant sum from his own father mere weeks after her death. Sebastian's hands clenched into fists as he spoke, and Charlotte saw the terrible truth written in every rigid line of his body. He had known, on some level, that his wife's death had been no accident. He had suspected, but could not prove, had questioned, but found no answers, and the helpless rage of that failure had been eating at him for 5 years like a slow poison. He had thrown himself into politics and power, had built walls of cold competence around his wounded heart, but he had never forgotten the bitter taste of injustice or the way society had dismissed his concerns just as they had dismissed Charlotte's. And now, sitting across from this shabby widow with her careful observations and her unshakable conviction, he recognized a kindred spirit, someone else who had seen what others refused to see, someone else who understood that evil could wear a gentleman's face, and that murder could be committed in grand houses by people who believed themselves above suspicion or consequence. The shared understanding that passed between them in that moment was more intimate than any declaration, a recognition of mutual pain and mutual purpose that bound them together in ways neither could have anticipated. By the time Charlotte left Thornfield House that evening, they had formed an alliance that would have scandalized London society if anyone had known about it. Sebastian had agreed to use his considerable influence to reopen certain avenues of investigation, to ask questions that a penniless widow could never ask, to examine evidence that had been conveniently overlooked or dismissed. Charlotte, in turn, would continue her own quiet investigation among the servants and lower circles, where gossip flowed freely and where a companion was invisible enough to hear truths that would never reach aristocratic ears. They would meet regularly to share information, working together to build a case strong enough to overcome the natural reluctance of authorities to believe that a gentleman could be a murderer. It was dangerous, potentially ruinous for both of them if their suspicions proved unfounded. But as Charlotte walked home through the darkening London streets, she felt more alive and purposeful than she had in years. For the first time since her husband's death had reduced her to a position of dependence and invisibility. She had found someone who valued her mind, who listened to her observations, who treated her as an equal partner in an endeavor that mattered. She did not yet recognize the feeling stirring in her chest as she thought of Sebastian's intense grey eyes and the unexpected vulnerability he had shown her. But it was there nonetheless, a small, warm seed that would grow into something neither of them could have predicted or prevented. The weeks that followed brought Charlotte and Sebastian together in a partnership that defied every social convention and expectation of their world. They met in secret, always carefully, always with propriety observed just enough to avoid scandal, but bent enough to allow for genuine collaboration. Sometimes Charlotte came to Thornfield House under the pretense of delivering messages from Lady Pemberton, who remained blissfully ignorant of how her companion was spending those long afternoon hours. Other times they met in the dusty corners of lending libraries or in the back rooms of print shops, where Sebastian maintained connections for his political work. Slowly, methodically, they built their case against Lord Fairfax, with the patience of hunters tracking dangerous prey. Charlotte continued to gather intelligence from the servant networks that crisscrossed London like invisible threads, learning that Lord Fairfax had purchased a new wardrobe and settled his gambling debts within days of the Duke's death, that he had been overheard making arrangements to sell one of the smaller Greystone estates, that his demeanor had shifted from desperate anxiety to smug satisfaction almost overnight. Meanwhile, Sebastian used his political connections to quietly review the original investigation, discovering that the magistrate who had closed the case so quickly was a man who owed Lord Fairfax's family considerable favors, and that the physician who had examined the body had performed only the most cursory autopsy before declaring the death accidental. But it was not just the investigation that deepened during those weeks. Something else was growing between Charlotte and Sebastian, something neither of them had anticipated or sought, but that became impossible to ignore as they spent hours together in close conversation. Charlotte had expected to find Sebastian cold and imperious, a man so far above her station that any real connection would be impossible. Instead, she discovered a brilliant mind that matched her own in its capacity for observation and logical deduction, a dry wit that occasionally broke through his stern facade to make her laugh unexpectedly, and beneath all the aristocratic armor, a wounded heart that still ached for justice denied and love lost. She watched the way his expression softened when he spoke about his work to improve conditions for tenant farmers, the way his hands moved with unconscious grace as he sketched out theories and connections on paper, the way his rare smiles transformed his severe face into something almost beautiful. And she felt her own careful defenses beginning to crumble in ways that terrified her, because she knew that women in her position did not allow themselves to develop feelings for men like the Marquis of Thornfield. Sebastian, for his part, found himself equally unsettled by Charlotte Winters. He had agreed to work with her out of a combination of guilt over his wife's unavenged death and intellectual curiosity about her observations, expecting to humor her briefly before discovering that her theories were as unfounded as everyone else believed. Instead, he had found a woman whose mind operated with a precision and clarity that would have impressed him in a man and astonished him in a woman of her limited education and opportunities. She saw patterns where others saw only random events, remembered details that trained investigators had overlooked, and possessed an emotional intelligence that allowed her to read people's motivations and deceptions with uncanny accuracy. But more than her intelligence, it was her courage that moved him. The way she refused to be silenced or dismissed despite having no power or position to protect her. The way she pursued truth and justice even when it meant risking the little security she possessed. The way she faced his initial coldness and skepticism with dignity rather than the simpering deference he usually received from women of lower status. She reminded him of Catherine in some ways, yet she was wholly herself, and he found himself thinking about her at odd moments, remembering the way her dark eyes lit with fierce determination when they uncovered a new piece of evidence, the way her hands moved gracefully as she wrote in that ever-present notebook, the quiet strength in her voice when she spoke about things that mattered. The turning point came on a cold November evening, when their investigation had hit what seemed like an insurmountable wall. They had evidence, suspicions, and logical conclusions, but nothing that would hold up in a court of law or convince the authorities to act against a newly titled duke. Lord Fairfax had been too careful, had covered his tracks too well, and the longer they investigated without results, the more dangerous their position became. If Fairfax discovered what they were doing, he had the power and resources to destroy them both, to ruin Sebastian's political career through carefully planted scandals, to ensure Charlotte never worked in a respectable house again, or worse. They sat together in Sebastian's library that evening, surrounded by papers and notes that represented weeks of work, but seemed suddenly inadequate, and Charlotte felt despair rising in her throat like bile. She had been so certain that the truth would be enough, that justice would prevail if only someone would look closely enough. But now she understood what Sebastian had learned 5 years earlier, that sometimes the guilty went free because they had power and position, and the truth died in silence, because no one with authority cared enough to fight for it. Sebastian watched the hope drain from Charlotte's face and felt something crack inside his carefully maintained emotional control. He could not bear to see her defeated, could not stand to watch another person he cared about be crushed by the machinery of privilege and injustice. And in that moment of recognition that he cared about her deeply and dangerously, he made a decision that would change everything. He told her, his voice rough with emotion he could no longer entirely suppress, that he would not let her fight this battle alone, that he would not allow Lord Fairfax to escape justice as Lord Ashworth had done, that he would use every weapon in his considerable arsenal to expose the truth, even if it meant destroying his own reputation in the process. And then, in a moment of vulnerability that surprised them both, he reached across the desk and took her hand in his and told her about the nightmares that still haunted him 5 years after Catherine's death, about the guilt of having failed to protect her, about the hollow emptiness of a life devoted solely to power and politics, without any real human connection. He told her that she had awakened something in him that he thought had died with his wife. Not a replacement for Catherine, but something new and unexpected, a recognition that perhaps second chances existed even for those who had failed so catastrophically the first time. And as Charlotte sat there with her hand warm in his, listening to this powerful, formidable man reveal the depths of his pain and loneliness, she understood that what was growing between them was far more than a partnership in investigation. It was the beginning of something that could heal them both or destroy them completely, and she was no longer certain which outcome frightened her more. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected source, a young housemaid named Molly, who had served at Greystone Manor and who sought out Charlotte in a state of terrified agitation 3 days after that evening of confessions in Sebastian's library. The girl had heard through the servant networks that Mrs. Winters was asking questions about the Duke's death, and she carried information that had been weighing on her conscience like a stone. On the night of the Duke's death, Molly had been returning to the servants' quarters after delivering hot water to one of the guest rooms when she had seen Lord Fairfax emerging from the Duke's private study with something clutched in his hand, a small vial that caught the lamplight as he quickly concealed it in his coat. At the time she had thought nothing of it, assuming it was medicine or perhaps spirits, but after the Duke's death and Lord Fairfax's sudden elevation to the title, the memory had haunted her with increasing dread. She was terrified to speak to anyone of importance, knowing that her word as a mere housemaid would mean nothing against that of a duke, but Charlotte's status as someone between the servant class and the gentry made her feel safe enough to unburden herself of this dangerous knowledge. Charlotte listened with her heart pounding, recognizing immediately the significance of what she was hearing, and she questioned the girl gently but thoroughly about every detail, the time, the exact location, whether anyone else had seen, whether Lord Fairfax had noticed her presence. Armed with this new information, Charlotte and Sebastian shifted the focus of their investigation in a direction that should have been obvious from the beginning. If the Duke's death had not been a simple matter of pushing him down the stairs, if it had been more sophisticated than that, then perhaps they should be looking not at the fall itself, but at what had preceded it. Sebastian used his connections to quietly obtain the physician's original autopsy notes, documents that had been filed away and forgotten once the death was ruled accidental. What they found there made Charlotte's blood run cold, a mention buried in the technical language and dismissed as irrelevant, that the Duke's pupils had been unusually dilated and that there had been traces of what the physician had assumed was simply the brandy the Duke was known to consume before bed. But Sebastian, whose political work had occasionally brought him into contact with the darker aspects of London's criminal underworld, recognized the description as consistent with certain plant-based toxins that could cause disorientation, loss of balance, and confusion. Substances that would make even a sober man stumble and fall, especially if he were startled or confronted at the top of a long staircase. It was brilliant in its simplicity, really. Poison the Duke just enough to impair his balance and judgment, then ensure he was near the stairs when the effects took hold, and let gravity do the rest of the work. The fall would disguise the true cause of death, and any traces of the toxin would be attributed to the brandy, or simply overlooked in the brief examination. But knowing what had happened, and proving it in a way that would convince the authorities were two entirely different challenges. They needed more than the testimony of a frightened housemaid and their own theories about toxins. They needed physical evidence, or a confession, or some public revelation dramatic enough that it could not be dismissed or covered up by those who preferred convenient accidents to inconvenient murders. And that was when Sebastian conceived of a plan so audacious that Charlotte's first reaction was to think he had gone mad. In 2 weeks' time, London society would gather for the Grand Memorial Ball in honor of the late Duke of Greystone, an event that would bring together every person of consequence in England, including Lord Fairfax in his new role as the Duke of Greystone. It would be his formal debut as the head of one of England's greatest families, the moment when society would officially accept his elevation and legitimize his inheritance, and Sebastian proposed that they use that very public, very prestigious occasion to expose him as a murderer in front of everyone who mattered. It was risky beyond measure, potentially disastrous if they failed, but it offered something that no quiet legal proceeding ever could: the court of public opinion, the power of scandal and shame that could destroy a man's reputation even if the law could not touch him. Charlotte listened to Sebastian outline his plan with a mixture of terror and exhilaration coursing through her veins. He would use his position and influence to ensure that certain people were present at the ball: the physician who had performed the autopsy, the magistrate who had closed the case, experts on toxicology whom Sebastian knew through his government work, and most importantly, members of the press who could spread the story across London faster than any official channels. Charlotte would attend as well, not as a companion lurking in the shadows, but as Sebastian's personal guest, a positioning that would raise eyebrows, but would also give her the social standing necessary to be heard when the moment came. Together, during the ball's ceremonial speeches when Lord Fairfax would be publicly honoured and toasted, they would present their evidence in a manner so public and so dramatic that it could not be ignored or swept away. The housemaid would testify about the vial. The physician would be forced to reconsider his cursory examination in light of new evidence about toxins, and Sebastian himself would use his considerable reputation and oratorical skills to paint a picture of murder that even the most skeptical observer would find difficult to dismiss. It was theatre, certainly, but sometimes theatre was necessary to cut through the comfortable lies that society preferred to uncomfortable truths. The 2 weeks before the ball passed in a blur of preparation and planning. Sebastian coached Charlotte on exactly what to say and when, helping her organize her observations into a narrative that would be both compelling and credible. He also did something that shocked London society to its core. He was seen escorting Charlotte to a museum exhibition, then to a public lecture, then to a small but respectable dinner party, each appearance carefully calculated to establish her as someone under his protection and patronage, someone whose word would carry weight because he had chosen to associate with her. The gossip spread like wildfire, as he had known it would. The powerful Marquis of Thornfield, who had been a recluse since his wife's death, was suddenly appearing in public with a mysterious widow of no particular family or fortune. Some whispered that she was his mistress, others that she was a distant relative he was obligated to sponsor, but everyone agreed that Sebastian Ravenswood did nothing without purpose, and his sudden championing of this unknown woman must mean something significant. Charlotte endured the stares and whispers with as much grace as she could muster, sustained by Sebastian's steady presence at her side, and by the knowledge that every eye watching them now would also be watching at the memorial ball when the truth finally came to light. She was terrified, exhilarated, and utterly committed to seeing this through to whatever end awaited them, even if that end meant her own social destruction. Because some things mattered more than security or reputation, and justice for a murdered duke was one of them. The night of the Grand Memorial Ball arrived with all the cold brilliance of a winter star, and Charlotte stood before the mirror in her borrowed bedroom, feeling as though she were preparing for battle rather than a social event. Lady Pemberton, blessedly incurious about the sudden transformation in her companion's circumstances, had been persuaded to lend Charlotte a gown appropriate for such an occasion, a deep emerald silk that had belonged to the lady's daughter, and that fit Charlotte's slender frame almost perfectly after hasty alterations. It was not the height of current fashion, but it was respectable and elegant, and more importantly, it would allow Charlotte to move through the glittering crowds at Greystone Manor without the invisibility that had been her constant companion for so long. Tonight she needed to be seen, to be heard, to stand as a credible witness rather than a shadow in the corner. Her hands trembled as she pinned up her dark hair, and she had to pause several times to steady her breathing and calm the nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. Everything they had worked for, everything they had discovered, all of it came down to the next few hours. If their plan succeeded, a murderer would be exposed and justice would finally be served. If it failed, Charlotte would be ruined beyond recovery, and Sebastian's reputation would be damaged in ways that might take years to repair. Sebastian arrived to collect her in his magnificent carriage, and when Charlotte stepped outside and saw him waiting in the lamplight, her breath caught in her throat in a way that had nothing to do with nerves about the evening ahead. He was dressed in formal black evening clothes that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame, and his grey eyes warmed with something that looked remarkably like admiration when he saw her. He handed her into the carriage with a courtesy that felt intimate rather than merely polite, and as they rolled through the London streets toward Greystone Manor, he reached across the space between them and took her hand in his. He told her that no matter what happened tonight, no matter how society reacted or what consequences they faced, he wanted her to know that these past weeks working with her had meant more to him than anything had since Catherine's death. He told her that she had reminded him what it meant to fight for something that mattered, to value truth over comfort, and to trust another person with the wounded parts of oneself. And then, in words that made Charlotte's heart stutter and race, he told her that when this night was over, regardless of the outcome, he intended to ask her a question that had nothing to do with investigations or justice, and everything to do with the future he hoped they might build together. Charlotte could not find words to respond to that declaration, could only squeeze his hand tightly and blink back the sudden burning in her eyes. She had entered into this alliance expecting nothing beyond the satisfaction of exposing a killer, had trained herself not to hope for anything more than Sebastian's respect and partnership. But somewhere along the way, in those long hours of conversation and shared purpose, in the moments when he had revealed his pain and she had offered understanding, in the gradual recognition that they were two wounded souls who had somehow found unexpected healing in each other's company, hope had taken root, despite all her efforts to prevent it. She had fallen in love with Sebastian Ravenswood, deeply and irrevocably, though she had never allowed herself to speak or even fully acknowledge the feeling until this moment. And now, on the night when everything hung in the balance, he was telling her that he felt the same, that he saw a future for them beyond this single night of reckoning. It was almost too much to process, too overwhelming to believe, and Charlotte forced herself to focus on the immediate challenge ahead rather than on dreams that might never be realized if their plan failed catastrophically. Greystone Manor blazed with light and music when they arrived, its windows glowing like jewels against the dark November sky. Every person of consequence in London seemed to be in attendance, the cream of society, gathered to honor a dead duke and welcome his successor into the fold. Charlotte and Sebastian made their entrance together, and the whispers that followed them through the receiving line were like a physical presence. Everyone wanted to know who this mysterious woman was, why the Marquis of Thornfield was showing her such marked attention, what her presence at this particular event might signify. Lord Fairfax, resplendent in his new ducal finery, greeted them with the smooth confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, though Charlotte thought she detected a flicker of unease in his eyes when Sebastian made a point of presenting Charlotte by name and expressing his gratitude for her keen observations regarding his late friend's death. The comment was subtle enough to avoid causing immediate alarm, but pointed enough to plant seeds of curiosity in those standing nearby. Sebastian was a master at this kind of social maneuvering, Charlotte realized, knowing exactly how to use words and gestures to shape perception and expectation. They moved through the glittering ballroom with purpose, Sebastian making certain they were seen by all the key players he had positioned throughout the crowd. The physician who had performed the autopsy stood near the refreshment table, looking uncomfortable in his formal clothes, and clearly wondering why the Marquis had personally requested his attendance. The magistrate who had closed the investigation lounged near the card room, already slightly drunk and oblivious to the trap being set around him. Two gentlemen whom Sebastian had introduced to Charlotte as experts in toxicology and criminal investigation lingered near the musicians, ostensibly enjoying the music but actually watching the crowd with sharp, professional eyes. And scattered throughout the room were several journalists whom Sebastian knew and had subtly encouraged to attend, men whose publications reached every corner of London society and whose reporting could make or destroy reputations overnight. All the pieces were in place, all the players assembled. Now they simply had to wait for the moment when Lord Fairfax would take the stage to deliver the traditional speech honouring his predecessor, the moment when Sebastian and Charlotte would shatter his world and vindicate the Duke's memory with truth that could no longer be hidden or dismissed. The moment arrived shortly before midnight, when the orchestra fell silent and Lord Fairfax ascended to the small dais that had been erected at the far end of the ballroom for the evening's ceremonial speeches. The crowd gathered around him in a glittering semicircle, champagne glasses in hand, faces arranged in expressions of solemn respect appropriate for an occasion honouring the dead. Lord Fairfax looked every inch the Duke as he stood there in the lamplight, his new signet ring gleaming on his finger, his bearing confident and assured. He began his speech with all the proper sentiments: gratitude for the honour of inheriting such a great title, sorrow for the tragic loss of his beloved cousin, promises to uphold the dignity and traditions of the Greystone name. His voice was smooth and practiced, his words carefully chosen to strike exactly the right balance between humility and authority. The assembled aristocrats nodded approvingly, many dabbing at their eyes with handkerchiefs as Lord Fairfax painted a touching picture of the late Duke's virtues and the terrible accident that had stolen him from them too soon. It was a masterful performance, Charlotte thought bitterly, watching this murderer accept sympathy and acclaim for a death he had orchestrated with cold calculation. Sebastian waited until Lord Fairfax reached the crescendo of his speech, the moment when he raised his glass to toast the late Duke's memory and invite the assembly to join him in honouring Greystone's legacy. And then, in the brief pause before hundreds of voices could respond with the traditional words of tribute, Sebastian's voice rang out across the ballroom with the clarity and authority of a man accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful people. He did not shout, did not need to. His tone carried such weight and conviction that every head turned toward him instantly. He thanked Lord Fairfax for his moving tribute, his words dripping with irony that only those paying close attention would detect, and then suggested that before they honoured the late Duke's memory with a toast, perhaps they should first honour it with truth. The ballroom went absolutely silent, the kind of shocked, breathless quiet that descends when society senses scandal about to erupt. Lord Fairfax's face went pale, then flushed with anger, and he demanded to know what the Marquis meant by such a cryptic and inappropriate interruption. Sebastian smiled, and there was nothing warm or pleasant in that expression. He meant, he said clearly, that the Duke of Greystone had not died in a tragic accident, but had been murdered, and that the man now wearing his title and spending his fortune was the one who had killed him. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Gasps and exclamations erupted throughout the ballroom. Ladies clutched at their companions' arms, and Lord Fairfax's face transformed from anger to something that looked very much like panic before he managed to school his features back into outraged innocence. He called Sebastian's accusation outrageous, demanded an immediate apology, threatened legal action for such slander spoken publicly before witnesses. But Sebastian had anticipated every objection, every defense, and he met each one with calm, devastating precision. He did not make wild accusations without evidence, he informed the shocked assembly. He had spent weeks investigating the Duke's death alongside a witness whose observations had initially raised questions that deserved answers, and here he gestured toward Charlotte, drawing every eye in the room to her. She felt her face burn under the weight of hundreds of curious, skeptical stares, but she lifted her chin and met them with as much dignity as she could summon, refusing to shrink back into invisibility now when everything depended on her being seen and believed. Sebastian then proceeded to lay out their case with the skill of a barrister addressing a jury, transforming the glittering ballroom into a courtroom where Lord Fairfax stood accused before the highest judges in the land, his peers, whose opinion could destroy him more thoroughly than any legal verdict. He described Charlotte's observations from the night of the death, the details that the official investigation had dismissed or ignored, the defensive wounds, the torn jacket, the disturbed carpet, the positioning of the body. He called upon the physician who had performed the autopsy to confirm that yes, these injuries had been noted, and yes, they could be consistent with a struggle rather than a simple fall, though at the time he had not considered that possibility, because who would suspect murder in such circumstances? The physician, sweating under the weight of hundreds of judgmental eyes, admitted reluctantly that perhaps his examination had been less thorough than it should have been, that he had made assumptions based on the family's status and the desire to spare them additional pain. Sebastian then invited his toxicology experts to explain how certain plant-based poisons could cause exactly the kind of disorientation and loss of balance that might make a man fall downstairs, and how traces of such substances might be mistaken for or hidden by the presence of alcohol in the victim's system. The crowd was riveted now, hanging on every word, and Charlotte could see belief beginning to dawn in many faces. This was not the hysterical accusation of a vengeful woman, or the wild theory of a conspiracy-minded eccentric. This was the Marquis of Thornfield, one of the most respected men in England, presenting a carefully constructed case backed by expert testimony and physical evidence. But Sebastian was not finished. He called forward young Molly, the housemaid who had seen Lord Fairfax with the vial on the night of the Duke's death. And though the girl trembled so violently that Charlotte feared she might faint, she managed to repeat her testimony in a voice that carried across the silent ballroom. She described what she had seen when she had seen it, and how the memory had haunted her once she understood its significance. And then Sebastian delivered his final devastating blow. He revealed that he had used his connections to investigate Lord Fairfax's financial situation both before and after the Duke's death, and he presented documentation showing debts totaling nearly £20,000 paid off within days of inheriting the title. Luxury purchases made with suspicious speed, and most damning of all, a receipt from an apothecary known for selling substances. To those who asked no questions, a receipt dated 2 days before the Duke's death, and signed with initials that matched Lord Fairfax's own. The cumulative weight of evidence was crushing, undeniable, and as Sebastian fell silent and the ballroom remained frozen in shocked recognition of what they had just heard, Charlotte saw Lord Fairfax's face crumble from outraged innocence into something closer to desperate calculation, the look of a trapped animal searching frantically for escape. Lord Fairfax tried to rally, tried to dismiss the accusations as circumstantial fantasies woven together by a vindictive Marquess and his scheming mistress, but his voice lacked conviction, and his eyes betrayed the fear that he could no longer completely hide. He demanded to know what possible motive the Marquis of Thornfield could have for making such outrageous claims, what benefits Sebastian could derive from destroying a peer's reputation with lies and innuendo. And that was when Sebastian delivered the blow that Charlotte had not anticipated, the personal revelation that transformed this from a mere criminal investigation into something far more profound. He told the assembled crowd about Catherine, about his wife's death 5 years earlier, in circumstances that had never quite made sense, about the cursory investigation that had ruled it an accident, despite evidence suggesting otherwise, about the helpless rage of knowing that someone had taken the person he loved most and escaped justice because society preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. His voice shook with emotion as he spoke, the careful control he had maintained throughout the evening finally cracking to reveal the wounded heart beneath. He told them that he had failed Catherine by not fighting hard enough, by accepting the official verdict, when every instinct screamed that it was wrong, and that he would not fail the Duke of Greystone the same way. He would not allow another murderer to walk free, to profit from his crime, to be welcomed into society as though he had not stolen a life for money and position. The confession of his own pain and failure struck the assembly like a physical force, and Charlotte saw faces throughout the ballroom transform from skeptical curiosity to genuine emotion. Sebastian Ravenswood was not known for displays of feeling, was famous for his cold control and aristocratic reserve, and to see him lay bare his grief and regret before them all gave his accusations a weight that no amount of evidence alone could have achieved. Here was a man who had everything to lose and nothing to gain by pursuing this investigation. A man motivated not by jealousy or ambition, but by the purest desire for justice and the determination to prevent another family from suffering the loss he had endured. And then Sebastian turned to Charlotte, and what he said next made her heart stop and the entire ballroom hold its collective breath in astonishment. He told them that Mrs. Charlotte Winters had been the one to see what no one else had seen, to question what everyone else had accepted, to pursue truth when it would have been far easier and safer to remain silent. He told them that she possessed a mind of remarkable clarity and observation, a courage that put most men to shame, and a moral compass that refused to bend even when she had been dismissed, ridiculed, and threatened for speaking uncomfortable truths. He told them that over the past weeks of working alongside her, he had come to recognize in her not just an invaluable ally in the pursuit of justice, but the finest woman he had ever known. And then, in a moment that would be discussed in London drawing rooms for years to come, Sebastian Ravenswood descended from the dais, crossed the ballroom floor to where Charlotte stood frozen in shock, and dropped to one knee before her in front of hundreds of witnesses. The gasps that erupted were so loud they nearly drowned out his words, but Charlotte heard every syllable with crystal clarity as he asked her to do him the extraordinary honor of becoming his wife. He told her that she had awakened something in him that he thought had died with Catherine, that she had shown him it was possible to trust again, to hope again, to believe that love could survive loss and grow even stronger from the healing. He told her that he wanted to spend the rest of his life championing her brilliance, protecting her courage, and ensuring that she never again had to hide her light or diminish herself to suit society's narrow expectations. And he told her, with a vulnerability that made Charlotte's eyes fill with tears, that he loved her with a depth and certainty that terrified him, but that he would no longer deny or resist, because life was too short and too precious to waste on fear when happiness stood within reach. Charlotte could not speak for a long moment, could only stare down at this powerful, formidable man kneeling before her with his heart in his eyes, offering her not just his name and position, but his genuine love and partnership. She was aware of the hundreds of eyes watching them, of the scandal and gossip this moment would generate, of the fact that everything was happening in the most public and dramatic fashion imaginable. But she was also aware that this was the vindication she had never dared to dream of, not just the exposure of a murderer, but the public validation of her own worth by a man whose opinion mattered more to her than that of all the rest of society combined. Sebastian was telling everyone who mattered that Charlotte Winters was not invisible, not insignificant, not merely a poor widow to be pitied or dismissed. He was declaring before witnesses that she was extraordinary, valuable, worthy of being chosen by one of England's most eligible and powerful peers. It was the most profound form of social vindication possible, and it came wrapped in an offer of genuine love from a man she had come to admire and care for more deeply than she had thought herself capable of feeling again. Through tears that she no longer tried to hide, Charlotte gave him her answer, a simple, trembling yes that somehow carried across the silent ballroom and released a storm of reaction. Some guests applauded, caught up in the romance and drama of the moment. Others whispered furiously about the impropriety and scandal of such a public proposal. But Charlotte barely noticed any of it, because Sebastian had risen to his feet and pulled her into his arms, holding her with a fierce protectiveness that said more clearly than words that he would shield her from any consequences of this night's revelations. And then, as if the evening had not already provided enough shock and sensation, the magistrate who had been standing near the card room pushed forward through the crowd and announced in a loud official voice that, based on the evidence presented tonight, he had no choice but to reopen the investigation into the Duke of Greystone's death and to take Lord Fairfax into custody for questioning. The newly minted Duke tried to run, actually turned and attempted to flee through the crowd, but several footmen and guests blocked his path, and within moments he was surrounded, his escape cut off, his guilt written plainly in his panicked attempts to evade arrest. The man who had thought himself untouchable, who had believed that murder could be disguised as accident, and that money and title would protect him from consequences, was led from his own memorial ball in disgrace, while the society he had tried to deceive watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. The trial of Lord Edmund Fairfax became the sensation of the season, dominating newspapers and conversations throughout the winter months. The evidence that Charlotte and Sebastian had so carefully assembled proved devastating, under the scrutiny of legal examination, and when combined with Fairfax's attempted flight from the memorial ball, left little doubt in anyone's mind about his guilt. The apothecary who had sold him the toxin was located and testified in exchange for leniency, confirming that Fairfax had purchased a preparation known to cause disorientation and balance disruption. The housemaid's testimony about the vial was corroborated by other servants who recalled Fairfax's suspicious behavior that evening. And perhaps most damning of all, a thorough search of Fairfax's rooms uncovered a journal detailing his mounting debts and his increasingly desperate calculations about how to escape ruin, with entries that stopped abruptly 2 days before the Duke's death and resumed afterward with notes about selling estate properties and settling accounts. By the time the verdict was read, guilty of murder, even Fairfax's own solicitors seemed relieved that justice had been served. He was transported to await his fate, stripped of the title he had killed to obtain, and the Greystone dukedom passed to the late Duke's nephew, a young man of good character who expressed profound gratitude to both Charlotte and Sebastian for their courage in pursuing truth against such overwhelming social pressure to let sleeping matters rest. Charlotte and Sebastian were married in a quiet ceremony 6 weeks after the memorial ball, though there was nothing quiet about the social upheaval their union represented. A marquis marrying a penniless widow would have been scandal enough, but a marquis elevating to the position of his marchioness, the woman who had solved a murder that all of society's institutions had failed to recognize, was something else entirely. The wedding breakfast was attended by a curious mix of guests: aristocrats who admired Sebastian's integrity and romantic gesture, reformers who saw Charlotte's story as evidence that women's observations and intelligence deserved serious consideration, and enough journalists to ensure that every detail was reported across England. Charlotte walked down the aisle of the chapel in a gown of ivory silk, and when she placed her hand in Sebastian's and spoke her vows, she felt the last vestiges of her old invisibility fall away like a discarded cloak. She was no longer the ignored widow, the dismissed companion, the woman whose voice carried no weight. She was the Marchioness of Thornfield, partner to one of England's most influential men, and more importantly, she was seen, heard, and valued for exactly who she was. Their life together in the months and years that followed became a partnership in more than just name. Sebastian consulted Charlotte on his political work, valuing her insights into human nature and her ability to see patterns that others missed. Together, they quietly investigated several other suspicious deaths among the aristocracy, bringing justice to cases that might otherwise have been swept aside as tragic accidents. Charlotte established a network to help other women in vulnerable positions, particularly widows and orphans, ensuring they had resources and advocates when society tried to render them invisible or take advantage of their powerlessness. And Sebastian, who had lived in cold isolation since Catherine's death, found himself gradually warming back to life under Charlotte's steady affection and partnership. They had a daughter 2 years after their marriage, a sharp-eyed little girl whom they named Catherine Eleanor, honoring both the past and the present, the loss that had shaped them and the love that had healed them. The Tun, which had initially been scandalized by their union, gradually came to accept and even admire the unconventional Marquess and Marchioness of Thornfield, though there were always whispers about how Charlotte had risen from nothing to everything through a combination of intelligence, courage, and one very public proposal. But Charlotte never forgot where she had come from or what it had felt like to be dismissed and underestimated. On the 5th anniversary of the memorial ball, she stood in the drawing room of Thornfield House, surrounded by friends and family gathered to celebrate, and she found herself thinking about that terrified woman who had stood in this very house years earlier, convinced she would be thrown out for daring to suggest that a gentleman could be a murderer. She thought about all the times she had been invisible, all the moments when her voice had been silenced, all the years when she had believed that her position in life was fixed and immutable, and she marveled at how completely wrong those assumptions had been, how a single decision to speak truth despite the cost had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone connected to that night's revelations. Sebastian found her standing by the window, lost in thought, and wrapped his arms around her from behind in the easy intimacy of long partnership. He asked what she was thinking about, and Charlotte smiled as she turned in his embrace to face the man who had seen her worth when no one else had bothered to look closely enough. Dear listener, Charlotte's story reminds us of a truth that echoes through time and circumstance, that your value is not determined by whether others choose to see it, but by whether you have the courage to insist upon it, even when the world tells you to be silent. There are moments in every life when we must decide whether to speak uncomfortable truths or accept comfortable lies, whether to pursue justice or settle for convenience, whether to risk everything we have for something we believe matters more than safety. Charlotte was not born to power or privilege, was not given advantages or opportunities, but she possessed something far more valuable, the integrity to trust her own observations and the courage to act on them regardless of the cost. And while few of us will ever solve murders or marry marquesses, all of us will face moments when we must choose between invisibility and risk, between silence and truth. Remember that the qualities that truly matter, intelligence, courage, moral clarity, the capacity for love and partnership, these are not distributed according to social position or wealth, but grow in the soil of character and choice. Your voice matters, your observations have value, and your insistence on truth and justice, even when it costs you dearly, has the power to change not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. Sometimes the greatest vindication is not in proving others wrong, but in proving yourself right, and having the courage to demand that the world acknowledge what you have always known about your own worth.